as chair of the SATAA, I'm delighted to welcome you, Rosemary, and I'm doing the over to you to enable an introduction moment without any more to be said.
Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm going to invite you to all pair up in breakout rooms to find out something that you've got in common culturally, a cultural difference between you, and what nosy question might you have for me in relation to me and culture. So I'm really open to whatever you might have for me, but it's an opportunity to get to know each other, those of you that don't. And Kirsty knows that she's pairing you up as far as possible, as she knows that you don't know each other. So how about 4 or 5 minutes in that breakout room? Okay.
Just to confirm that only the plenary is recorded, the breakout rooms won't be recorded.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Andrew.
Okay, off you go. I'm not sure if I can keep an eye on people joining when I'm in a breakout room. So you should be able to let them in though as co-host.
I should, shouldn't I? Where do they come in on? I never let people in, so I don't really know. Where do they come in?
You should have a pop-up thing, or if you click on participants, then you'll see on the side if anyone new comes in.
Okie dokie.
And then you can pop them in a room
or something. Yeah. Okay.
Right, how do I join the room then?
And
Hi. Sorry, someone dropped out, so you lost your person.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Want to pause the recording so we don't have to edit?
Okay, Sharon.
Okay, what's significant for me culturally being in the UK is how different South Africans are from British people. And it's actually quite hard to create close relationships with British people that I've met. I'm not saying it's like that for everybody, but that's how it's certainly been for me. And I tend to gravitate towards South Africans because we understand each other and talk the same language. And I find that there's a big emphasis in England on being politically correct. And that really gets up my nose. So, that for me is a big issue. Yeah. And I'm interested in how you see South Africans, because we're not the same.
Yeah, there are so many cultures, aren't there? And national culture is one of them. And I know when I've lived in other countries like you, it's difficult to cross cultural differences. And so I've tended, and I see British people tend to make friends with British people. And I see that in every country. And for migrant groups and refugee groups, I particularly feel incredibly touched, really, when the people of that country say they should make friends, we should disperse people, they need to go and make contact with the local people. It's not so easy. And it may be important to say to whoever the local people are, you need to go make contact with the people who are in a minority, who haven't lived all their lives in this system and don't quite know what it's like. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, how do the British see South Africans? I've no idea. But as soon as somebody opens their mouth or looks different, there is immediately all sorts of categorization that goes on by British people, because we have a class system. There is a class culture which dominates everything. It dominates race, it dominates ethnicity, and it's done, the class culture calculation in Britain is done as soon as people open their mouths, what they wear, how they look, and it's an immediate categorization.
Yeah.
And I'm not upholding it, I'm just saying it's there. Yeah.
And it's hard for people who come in.
And welcome, Sharon, to Britain. And you know, did you go to the TA conference?
No.
That might be good ways of networking through the TA community, if you want.
Don't feel at home in the TA community in England.
Ah, it's got other people in it. It's got other people in it. They're having a conference at the Freud Museum for TA trainers like you in November. Be a good place to be. Talk to you more about that separately. Okay. So, welcome, Sharon. Let's hear from somebody else. Wave, if you want. Rawia.
For me, the thing that interests me is the mix of cultures within me and the mix of cultures outside of me that I experienced, and how to find the balance, I suppose, is maybe the right word to, find the balance between all these cultures that are part of me and outside of me. And like Sharon says, you get to meet every day a new culture. Yeah. And the curiosity that is aroused within me about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Rawia, to let people know, I know Rawia. One of the things I'll be doing today is looking at that business of cultures inside, for sure. And Rawia, did you know there is somebody on this screen who lives along the road from you?
No.
Ah, there is.
I'd love to know.
There is. And maybe should you happen to say where you live, they'll react. And Karen, I see there is a TA trainer from UK who has just entered the screen, Sue. So you could maybe be welcomed by Sue, because Sue, welcome to you. Sharon is a TA trainer from South Africa that's moved to London. Can't hear you, Sue. Oh, can now. And was saying she's not sure that she wants contact yet with the TA community in UK. So maybe at some point we'll put you and Sharon in a breakout room and you can warm her up to the UK community.
Of course, thank you.
So Rawia, this idea of cultures inside us, absolutely, that internalization of cultures, very much part of what I want to talk about this morning. Yeah. And the cultures outside us, the ones we have to navigate. How is that for you, Rawia?
Well, I was just talking with Pooja and saying I've lived in different places. My background is Lebanon and Ghana. And then I've lived in the UK. I live now in the Netherlands, in The Hague in the Netherlands. I've lived in Oman, in Scotland. And there's always something, you think you're familiar with something. Like, for example, within North Europe, you think, oh, you know, coming from the UK to the Netherlands, there is no culture shock, but actually there is. Yeah. They are really very different. Cultures are very different. And that element of cultural shock and then adapting and understanding the culture you find yourself living in. Yeah.
And the shock is deep.
Sometimes, yes.
Deep. Yeah, it is deep. Much deeper than we perhaps realize, because we've internalized cultures. Yeah, so much part of our identity. So unconscious. Yeah. And what they say about people who move, as you have done as a grown-up, is that it's usually somewhere around the 3 to 6 month mark that the shock is at its absolute height. Because at first we're aware and it's like new and we know it will be different and we're open to it. but it's the little things which penetrate much more down the line when we think we've understood something and then realized we haven't, and we don't get it, and we probably never will either, and that's tough. Yeah. Thanks, Rawia. So anybody else got a question for me? Or anybody else want to say that they live up the road from Rawia?
I can put up my hand, Rawia. I also live in the Netherlands. I'm in Hilversum, currently, well, live in Hilversum, sitting in Hilversum. Is that close?
Yes, I think it's about an hour's drive.
Oh, everything's an hour's drive in the Netherlands, otherwise
Yes.
you're in Belgium.
It's a small country.
It is very small. And I can speak to having lived in, well, I was born in Holland in the Netherlands. I was 3 when I went to Australia, grew up in Australia with European parents, and came for an adventure 9 years ago to Europe, and still living in the Netherlands for 9 years. And this, what you've mentioned, Rosemary, about after 3 to 6 months, and I can distinctly pinpoint that moment of what have I done, and how am I going to survive, I guess. How am I going to make it through? And while I've been here for 9 years, I can distinctly say I really still have a strong sense of don't belong here.
Yeah.
I think that's the reaction of a lot of third culture kids or third culture adults, that sense of not belonging, of not having a home.
I think that's right, Sue, and welcome, Sue. Do you want to say something about your culture? And I've asked people if they've got any nosy questions about me and culture to be nosy. Curious, as Byrne would say.
Yeah, I am fascinated by culture. I have lived in Hampshire all my life, so I've not travelled at all. But my experience as a child was very much of being on the outside. We lived in a Navy estate. My father was in the Navy, he travelled, but we stayed put. Well, all around me, people were leaving and then coming back. And I had that real sense of nothing being stable. So yeah, white British, I identify as British, and bit of a mixture, really, as well.
Anything you want to know about me, Sue, in relation to culture or anything else? Or in anything else?
I don't think so, Rosemary. I mean, I've known you on and off for a little while, haven't I?
You have indeed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's get everybody's voice into our Zoom room. Somebody else like to introduce themselves, to add in, hello, little one. We've got Kirsty's.
I'll go quickly while things are calm. So yes, I'm Kirsty and this is Evie, and she loves TA. She literally started smiling as soon as she saw the screen.
Yeah, a TA baby.
A TA baby indeed. So I think that one of the things about cultural differences that we reflected on in my breakout room was the age difference of both growing up in South Africa and how I didn't really get to experience apartheid as immediately as Karen would have. And by the time I was old enough to know what was going on around me, things had started to change already. So I think that was the most glaringly obvious difference for me. And also being raised in a different religion and that kind of thing.
I think you flag up something really important there, Kirsty, which, let's bear in mind when we look at some things later. There are age cultures. Culture is not just about place. There is age. And the music that you listen to as an adolescent will be a key cultural piece for each of us. And there will be differences looking around the screen and noticing we have a variety of ages here. Absolutely. Yeah. And it won't just be music that's different. There'll be all sorts of other things, all sorts of other ways of seeing the world and understanding the world, which are to do with age. Yeah.
And I think the only question I really had for you, Rosemary, was I don't know much about you personally. I'm not sure if you have married or have children, or whereabouts you live, or anything like that, or what you did before TA. Yeah.
I can't remember before TA. I have a child who is about to have a child. So I'm about to become a grandmother for the first time.
Congratulations.
So yeah, so very grown up. Child as yours will be one day. Yeah. Yeah, and I live in Oxford. I'm coming to you from Oxford. I got back last night from Sweden, having been to see a childhood friend in Sweden, where we shared boyfriends and music a long time ago. And that was very interesting, to go somewhere that I hadn't been to for 50 years and see the difference, and to that cultural piece again. You know, the shift in culture. And in Sweden, if you are older, there is no attention paid to that, whereas in Britain there is a little bit. So on buses, people will give their seat when they see my wrinkles. In Sweden, no, absolutely not. So that was interesting. So here I am back in Oxford, and I know I'll get a seat on the bus later today.
I have a follow-up question. Your friend and you, yourself and your friend, where did you experience together when you were growing up? Where were you?
Oh, she was in Sweden and I was in UK, and we did an exchange. Yeah.
Okay.
Exchange, teenagers. Yeah. So let's get everybody's voice into the room. Who else would like to introduce themselves and be curious? Pooja. Oh no, Marguerite. Yeah, go for it, Marguerite. I saw you both watching for.
Yeah, so I'm in Cape Town, and I was paired up with Sharon, which was lovely because Sharon and I have met with each other many times through webinars and whatnot, but never actually spoken one-to-one. So we enjoyed that, and we did go a bit off the reservation because of that and not stick to the questions, but we did talk about the common in terms of religion. So Sharon is Jewish, I was raised Catholic, and what I did notice was how when we find common ground, there's such a lovely feeling in that, you know. So I could share with Sharon that my brother married a Jew in America, so my family in America is Jewish. So we have common, and then of course there are the differences. So that's where we went with this conversation.
I think that's so important, isn't it, Marguerite? When we find commonality, then there is something in our archaic child ego state that can resonate with each other.
Absolutely, that's how it feels.
Common experience and that sense then of bonding, which is so much greater because of commonality. Yeah. And religions are cultural. I mean, religious culture is, each religion has its own culture, and most religions have sects or sub-religions or subgroups that have their own particularities culturally, absolutely. And it is hugely influential. I think we underestimate just how much religion emphasis it has in all national cultures and ethnic cultures. Some of it's obvious, and there tends to be quite a lot of prejudice around about religions without acknowledging actually we are all so influenced by all sorts of religious ideas and religious cultural practices. Yeah. And one of the things I was particularly interested, I went to a TA workshop in 2002, we held a workshop at the beginning of 2002 on the veil, and looked at how the veil exists in all sorts of cultures. And it is not something unique to an Islamic perspective, which it was being pointed at that point. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Mm.
Oh, wow.
Absolutely.
Oh, I like that.
Look at some pictures of the Queen with her hats with little veil-y jobs which come down to about here. Think about the fringe, the purpose of the fringe.
The wedding veil.
And absolutely the wedding veil, and what, you know, technically happens, the lifting of the veil and all of that, about taking possession, all sorts of things. Yeah. Yeah. So we've just lost Pooja, who's about to come back. Hi, Pooja.
Hi, Rosemary, and hi, everyone. Thanks for this opportunity to have this conversation in the breakout room. And Ravia and I found a cultural connection to India. And also, as I was hearing others, I was reflecting on, as I grew up, I didn't change countries. However, I grew up in different cities, and I also got connected to how I found it very hard to belong. So that can also be a lot in terms of culture, and in spite of being in one country itself, how much of changes can come in. Yeah.
And India has so many different cultures within it. Where do you live now?
I'm currently in Indonesia.
Okay. And whereabouts in Indonesia?
In Jakarta.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up in India, in cities Mumbai, Bangalore, and Goa.
Okay. So Bangalore and Goa are so different from each other.
Yeah.
And then Jakarta, and well, it's completely different again, isn't it? Yeah. Wow. It's another country.
Yeah.
Yeah. And where does your heart belong, Pooja? You don't have to answer that, but it's a question for all of you. You know, where is your heart, as it were? Yeah. So, yeah. Who haven't we heard from? Andrew. Okay. Andrew and then Karen.
Yeah, I got paired up with Linda. It was we very quickly figured out our similarities of being what we think is first generation in a different country. So I'm my parents are Welsh, and I was born in South Africa. And something that Linda picked up that was a really curious insight was we both grew up in sunny countries, and Linda's had the experience of moving into the Netherlands where it isn't as sunny. So, and seeing how potentially the weather has impacted on the cultural disposition. And so that's, I resonate with being in the sunny place, but haven't had the experience of living in a place that doesn't have that as part of the culture. Yeah, for myself, it's been interesting hearing stories about how tight my Welsh family is, and yet me feeling very distant from them, and in some ways having it replicated by friends becoming family, but it's still feeling it doesn't feel like the stories sound that I hear from the family background.
Oh.
It's interesting.
It is, isn't it? I'm mindful as you talk about Wales. I do a lot of TA training in Latin America. And as you're probably aware, there is a Welsh origin community in Argentina, which I've been to visit, and they can all sing in Welsh, but they're Spanish, Argentinian people. They move and they dance and they do things that you'd never see a Welsh person do, and they don't actually really understand Welsh at all, but they can sing in it, and the churches and the villages are still like that. And this transplanting of cultures and finding your own culture is really what I hear you talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an ongoing journey.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And given what I touched on earlier about ages and there being different cultures, as it were, different age groups, it really is an ongoing journey. Yeah. Karen, welcome. You're in charge of this happening, I think, as well.
It's part of our SAAA team, but yeah, I also am calling in from Cape Town. Kirsty and I were together, and it was really interesting what you said, Rosemary, about when you find a commonality. Kirsty's already said she was brought up in the Jewish faith. I was brought up in the Christian faith, and when Kirsty named it, it almost surprised me, because I think we've already in our years of working together found such a commonality in a shared energy, spiritual connection that almost transcends outward religious labels. And it was, oh yes, of course, I do know that, but that was very interesting to me, how it wasn't a label top of mind until you named it, Kirsty, which is lovely to remind me of finding that actually there is a unity. My reading in my spiritual world is a lot around unitive consciousness, mystical teachings, non-duality, and that's where I'm feeling called to almost dip beneath what's going on up there, not to get away from it, but hopefully to come back and engage with it in a slightly different way.
So part of what I'm wanting to do in our session is to really invite each of you to examine just how deep and how subtle enculturation is into whatever cultures we've been part of, party to. I'm going to work with an adaptation of Denton Roberts' Thinking About Culture. And for that, I'm assuming that everybody is familiar with script and the ideas of script and scripting messages and so on, because that will be part of it. And to suggest to you all that, take yourselves as far or as deep as is appropriate for you. If you touch on something and you don't want to go there, don't go there. We're only here for another hour and a half together. Just don't go there. And likewise, in terms of sharing, please share what's appropriate for you. We won't have a confidentiality contract. As you know, we are being recorded when we're not in pairs. But I would like you to use yourselves, to use yourself to reflect upon. And for that, you probably need a pen and paper or a pencil and paper, because I'm going to ask you to do some self things. So if anybody needs to go and get pencil and paper or pen and paper, now's the time. And I want to invite you into reflective space. So I find when on Zoom, it's really important to hide self-view. That is stressful. So if you haven't hidden your self-view, now is the time. And to get a good arm's length from the screen, and turn your chair to an angle where you can gaze out of the window or at the wall or at an object somewhere, so that you've got reflective space. I think that's such an important thing to have in the learning environment. And of course, we are, in a very small way, co-creating a culture here. I won't attempt to define what is a culture. We will go with the meaning it has for you. And for you to perhaps wonder, what is the meaning of culture for you? How would you describe or define it? It's one of those anthropological and sociological terms which has got 400 or 500 definitions, all of which are interesting, none of which are true. It is a construct, and I invite you to construct it in whatever way you would like to do. So if you are up for a piece of reflective work and you've got a pencil and paper handy, and Kirsty, you might have to do it in your mind, I guess, rather than on paper, see how you go. What I'm going to do is go on to screen share, and I'm going to invite you to ponder, first of all, on what Denton Roberts thinks of as the first culture. And that's the culture of gender. He sees gender and messages, cultural messages about gender, being the first culture that we are exposed to. So I'm going to recommend that you draw a little picture of yourself in the middle of your sheet of paper, and we're going to add layers of culture around this. So that first culture that he suggests is there is gender. And think about, reflect on intuitively, jot down, what are the messages about gender that you received originally? And you might want to add messages along the way, because we are scripted, I would suggest, not only originally and culturally scripted, but actually that's an ongoing process. So if I think about myself and gender, I had a very strong message of don't be a girl. I was born not that long after World War II to somebody who was born not that long after World War I. Lots of men killed in both wars. There was a much higher value on the male. Plus, there were probably many other reasons within the culture I came from about a high value of male. It's a patriarchal society, patriarchal culture. And a very strong message of don't be a girl. There was no name ready for me. I didn't get named until the last minute, which is 6 weeks in. Boys were good. Girls, well, girls are dispensable. In my lifetime, I have had other messages along the way. Not surprisingly, became part of various feminist movements, their cultures within themselves. A workplace where there's emphasis on the rights of women and equal opportunity. So some other messages there. And right now, I live in a culture which, Sharon, you talked about as the political correctness. And one of the things that's very tricky at the moment is pronouns and gender, and how many genders are there? And am I a she or a they, or quite what to say and do. And for me, with this TA perspective on enculturation, it's very clear to me that even though at 16 weeks, the hormones of the mother in the womb might have an impact on the gender brain versus the gender body of the fetus. If you're born into the world with a male body, even though from the start you have a female brain and wish to be female, and usually by about the age of 4 to 5, that's pretty clear when there is a wish to be female. Nonetheless, the enculturation as a boy and a young man will be inevitably male. And therefore, when changing identity as a grown-up, the body might change with that change of identity, and certainly all sorts of things will change, but there will have been male cultural shaping that will have gone on in the early part of life. So I am clear on my non-politically correct perspective. I'm going to go off screen share because for some reason I've lost it. And let's see where I go to from here. So I'll come back on. So you've got some messages about gender, I hope. And it might have been attributions. It might have been injunctions. It might have been permissions that connect for you, both originally, but perhaps also in your life journey about gender, because those messages don't stop. That's one of the pieces that I think is so important to be thinking about scripting. It's an ongoing process, a lifetime process. Denton Roberts talked then about the next layer of scripting being family scripting, and that there are all sorts of messages in the family culture. So messages about family itself and in the centrality of family and family culture. What was family? How big was family? How small was family? What was considered family? There will be many messages about family itself, and there'll be many messages for each of us as individuals about our place within the family. So to be jotting down what messages might there have been about family and self in relation to that family. And some of these might have been at odds with the gender messages. So I had messages that I was not important as a girl, but in my nuclear family, I was an only child. So I got some very conflicting messages about my importance. So from pretty early on, I was having to manage, and of course it's a fairly unconscious process, the conflict between messages about importance, and make some sense of them, construct some sort of meaning, construct a way of living with these conflicting messages. For me, it may have been the opposite for you, it may be quite congruent messages. one of the things that Denton Roberts is proposing is these different cultures we're born into. And I would add that we might also move into, and we might change some of these cultures as we go along our life journey. That there can be conflicting messages. So Rawi, when you talked about the identities within you, the cultural identities within you, some of that will be conflict in the cultural messaging, I imagine, about how to be you in the world.
Yes, very, because there's the differences of, African culture versus Arab culture. There's the religion, Muslim and Catholic, black and white. It's many conflicting, and everybody has, each culture has a message that is different from the other, and they put down each other as well. So it's really a lot of conflicts, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm making a guided guess by looking at your eyes and where your eyes are about when you might be ready for another layer. And I think Denton Roberts ran into some problems about actually in what sequence are these layers. We're going to end up with the self as a bit like an onion. There will be many concentric or not quite concentric rings, which I like because there's also parallels for Nita English's idea of the child ego state, the concentric rings of the tree. But I'm not sure that there is necessarily a time development in the sense of awareness. And this is an aspect of culture that I think is really important. The fish doesn't know it's in the sea until you take the fish out of the sea. And it's one of the reasons I love to travel, is I don't know my own culture unless I go to other cultures and I experience something that makes me go, oh, that's different. I didn't expect that. And so we don't necessarily know, we're not necessarily aware of some of these layers of culture. And the next one that I want to go to, not because it's necessarily the next developmentally, it might be, it might not be, is I want to add in something that's not in Denton Roberts, which is education, school culture, educational culture, which starts off with preschool maybe, or school. I'm going to call it education. And I think one of the shocks that we probably all experience in our lives is when we change schools. Because we really get a sense of, oh, there's something, there are different cultures, there's something different here. And that's equally true, of course, in TA training. Try moving from one TA trainer and set up to another TA trainer and set up, and you might have shifted planets. It's all called TA, but it might be very different in all sorts of ways, both subtle and perhaps not so subtle. So we have all sorts of different educational cultures, and the messages that we get, how to be, what sort of person is accepted around here, how to belong, whether or not we belong. So again, a real invitation for you to jot down whatever might be educational messages that you picked up. And here you all are at a workshop. Yeah, so there must be something about education which is in some way inviting for you. And there will be people who don't go to workshops because there's been messages about education itself, as well as the messages to us as individuals that we receive. I'll shift to another layer, the layer here of religion, which we've already had some mention of. And I'll use religion in its broadest sense. Spirituality, beliefs, all of that. And what messages are there? What messages are there to us as individuals? The attributions, the permissions, the injunctions. What messages within the religion about gender? What messages within the religion about family? What messages in the religion about education? And are those compatible with the messages we get from education, from family, from our gender? Are there conflicts? Sometimes I marvel that we manage to navigate all these different cultures that we experience. Even if we do live in the same place all the time, Sue, we've navigated all of these, and it might give you some insight, perhaps, Sue, into that sense of belonging and not belonging that you touched on earlier, because we are navigating these. And then we come to a much more visible, or is it visible, culture of ethnicity. And a real question of, is it visible? Actually, as I'm sure those of you in South Africa will have had direct experience of, that our ethnicity may not show, may not be visible in the way it is actually experienced or inherited or genetically composed, in whatever way we want to think about that. And again, there's a lot about the construct of ethnicity, that this may not really exist in quite the way that perhaps we are generally thinking about ethnicity. And Sharon, back to political correctness here. What do I identify as? And is it okay to identify with that? How do I find others that I identify with? But what are the messages? I live in a broadly white society, or predominantly white society, and people still don't really use that idea of I'm white first. It's assumed that this is the majority, and therefore this is what society is. Much more adjectives used when somebody is anything else, and then that gets named. And what are the messages about the ethnicity? I'm working at the moment with a TA training group where we have a number of people, a range of ethnicities, and the difference that there is when you're born into a culture where you are the majority in how you feel about yourself. So, for example, we have somebody in a group who's born into a Black, predominantly Black African society, and the sense of self is very different from that of the sense of self when he talks to somebody also Black, born in Britain, and their sense of self, they're born into a majority white society. It's really interesting to hear them dialogue together and talk about this in the training group. So there is so much about the messages that we've picked up. And again, there may be connections or conflicts with messages about gender or about family, about education. And there may be a connection between ethnicity and religion. So all components of our identity. And this is way before we've touched on nationality. So really interesting to think about the complexity. And I would love to see much more complex ideas around script and scripting in TA because of this cultural scripting. And there are some psychologists in the United States, not TA, but other psychologists, who think that personality is 96% culturally constructed, not the old superficial Freudian ideas of mum and dad, but actually cultural construction. And I'd love to track down a lot more. If any of you have come across any of the writings about this out of the US, I'd be really grateful to get into that more. I've found very little other than it's out there. So let's go on to that area of nationality. Yet another piece of cultural scripting. Which may have conflicts with, or maybe synchronizes with some of the other messages that we might have got for other cultures that we belong to. And I want to add in here things like regionality. I think, Pooja, you talked about different parts of India, the difference between being brought up in Bangalore and in Goa, different regions make a huge difference.
Yes.
And I would add on another one here too, which is perhaps a little bit of a variation to regions, but is still part of this idea, which is where you brought up in a city or town or in the country. Very different cultures, pretty much across the world, whether you're urban or rural. And what your choice is now. And I want to add on more layers, because now some of you, Linda, for example, I know you are employed inside an organization. And there are organizational cultures, which are hugely significant. And when we think that we might spend at least a third maybe more of our waking day for years on end inside a particular organization with its own cultural values and codes of behavior, it is not surprising that we might adapt to being in that organization, and that culture might predominate now. It might have, the messages from that culture might have more significance to us now than some of the earlier messages might have had. So this idea of the ongoing scripting, that we change, that we develop, that our sense of identity is constantly shifting, and that our current identity might be so much influenced by our current cultures, and some of our identity so much influenced by our early cultures. I have never got past the Rolling Stones as part of my cultural heritage. Pop music has never been as good as that. That's it. So I show up sometimes to Rolling Stones concerts. They're doing a European tour coming up over the next couple of months, and I'm one of the youngest people there, which makes me laugh. And they are quite amazing. So here's another aspect to culture, which is not one that Denton Roberts talks about, but I'm very mindful of, which is this idea of age. Actually, there is something about age, which I think we can think about, and it may be different in different countries, for example. I'm always love it when I go to India. I am revered for being old. I find it difficult in Britain, where youth rules and youth culture has been significant for a long, long, long time. Goodness knows where the middle-aged might find their home. Suburban United States, maybe, where we feel we belong. These issues are really key. So I hope you've tracked some of the messages for yourself in terms of cultural identity. I'm going to send this to Kirsty, who hopefully can distribute it to you later. And of course, you can take a photograph of the screen as well. But this is an adaptation from Denton Roberts. And I'm using it rather differently from how he has. I will also send the article, which is an early TAJ article. I don't particularly go along with how he thought about how you could do treatment in psychotherapy of your cultural heritage. I'm much more a contemporary TA person that wants to say, let's appreciate our cultural heritage, past and present. Hi, Ritva. Great to see you here. And to appreciate this cultural heritage from that this is what we live with, and we live in a world with others. Carlo Moiso thought that belonging is a hunger, which Byrne didn't think about in his list of hungers. And he thought don't belong was a more powerful injunction than don't exist. And I think these are really useful things to be thinking about. So I'm going to ask Kirsty to set up some breakout rooms. And we are now 3, 6, 9, 10. I think we're an even number, Kirsty, for the breakout rooms. But if you could set out breakout rooms which are different from before, and to take 7 or 8 minutes, I'll bring you out of the breakout rooms to just reflect together on what you've been looking at. You don't have to share about yourself personally, but reflecting on these ideas of our cultural complexity, our heritage, how meaningful or not these ideas are for you. That's really my purpose of this piece. And hopefully that's given Kirsty a bit of time, chart-free time, to set up the breakout rooms of some difference. And Ritva, you'll meet somebody in a breakout room, I think, who might tell you what we've been doing. And you might even be in a 3. I'm not quite sure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And just to welcome Ritva from Finland, who's come in to join us.
Thank you. I'm sorry that I couldn't take part the first part. I thought the time differently, so I'm sorry.
Okay. How are you doing, Kirsty?
Nearly there.
Nearly there. Great.
I'm going to quickly go for a bathroom break. Whoever I'm paired with, I'll be back in a moment.
Okay. Anybody else wants to do that? This is a good time.
How long did you want the rooms for?
About 8 minutes.
Everybody off? Oh, hang on, Rosemary.
Yeah, I don't want to be in one, thanks.
Just don't accept the invitation to come to the room, Rosemary.
Okay. All right. Any comments or questions that you have at this point from your discussions?
I have something actually, Rosemary. And what struck me was how belonging could be a human hunger versus a injunction, actually. And then this whole push for diversity, equity, inclusion, for example, is really about belonging. And so that sense of belonging, yeah, could be defined as human hunger. And then that leads me on to wonder what other things could be in those hungers.
Yes, I'm with you there. And when we think about recognition hunger, the connection between recognition and belonging is massive. And it's possible, Byrne having lived such a short TA life, it's possible that that's part of what he meant, maybe.
I think originally he called it relationship hunger.
Did he so?
Yeah, and I think the diagram showing that is in Jean Isley Clark and Connie Dawson's book, Growing Up Again.
Okay.
But it's, I'm sure it was recognition hunger. I'm sure that's when I read it.
That it was relationship hunger.
Relationship hunger, yeah.
Which would again take us back to belonging.
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm certainly with Moisa. I do see belonging as being absolutely core. And if we look at the world and the move towards nationalism that's going on in our world at the moment, if we thought about that as part of the motivation, then we might be able to think differently about what the world needs in order to be more harmonious. Yeah. Karen.
It's interesting, the sense of belonging, and I so go with recognition, belonging being so key, but I think if I superimpose it on a framework like spiral dynamics, for some people belonging means putting in the walls of who I am in my group to keep out the others.
Yeah.
And as people move up that spiral, it's actually that expansiveness we can belong by including, not by separating and excluding.
Yeah. Yes, and I think about the existential idea there of being in the world with others. And what do we see as the world? So when you talk about the spiral dynamics development, that very much fits in with what's our perception of being in the world. What is the world? How do we see that? Yeah. 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 Any other thoughts or comments or queries? I like that link with inclusion and diversity issues, so much an issue for organisations and for governments to be thinking about.
What also struck me was that when we came back to the group, when we first did the breakout, we talked mostly about location of where we are and how complex culture is with so many different aspects.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a web, isn't it? It's a tangled web. I've drawn it as concentric circles, but of course it's not like that. If we think about it, it's much more three-dimensional, much more enmeshed web around us, each of us. And I'm as a metaphor, giving the ideas external. And I really want to come back to that idea, if you're happy for me to move on, to the internalization of cultures. And not a new idea to you all because you're all TA, but if our everyday experience is through the adult reality, or at least we would like it to be, perhaps, then our cultures, we absorb, we introject, whether it's as a 50-year-old inside an organization, the culture is introjected into the P2. And we've got Pearl Drago to thank for diagramming Burns' idea about culture into those elliptical 3 ellipses.
Are you trying to share the screen?
Sorry, thank you. There's me thinking it was shared. It's gone away.
Thank you.
So this idea that all those different cultures that we've named so far, the religious, the family, and so on, we will have swallowed them whole. We will have introjected them. And some of them will be fighting with each other in our parent ego state, as it were. And some of them will be colluding with each other in our parent ego state. And some of them will be having nothing to do with each other, as it were, within our parent ego state. All those different cultural interjects. So thanking Pearl Drago there for her way of drawing it. And then we've got our lived experience, the child ego state, which, as I said, it's quite nice to think of that finita English idea of our lived experience, where we will have lived through so many different cultural experiences. So when I talked this morning about that resonance between a couple of you, because you had something shared in that lived experience of the child ego state. So that resonance that went on in that connection, that there's something in common. And having that in common is so significant for us. So I'm really aware, having just been in Sweden, where they too have Ukrainian refugees, they're talking about how they are so much more like us than the Syrian refugees and the Afghan refugees and the Kurd refugees. And they're very open about saying that, unlike politically correct Britain that Sharon was talking about, where people might think that, but they don't say it. They only say it amongst their friends, but not in public. But that commonality is not, of course, just saying we've got something in our child ego states in common, but is also saying, there's some understanding of our interjected values, which, of course, there may not be. We are often misled by that commonality of lived experience in the child ego state, of assuming that that lived experience means a lot of other things are shared. And they often aren't. There is often significant other cultural differences, and that sharing is not there. And we can then feel very let down because, well, I thought we had a connection. And then discovering we don't. That psychological complexity, which may or may not really exist, and may or may not indicate that we've got particular values. Any thoughts, comments, questions about this before I go another step further? Okay, so I'll just go another step further here then, and let's look at the second order of ego states, because I think this is particularly important when it comes to cultural rejection and cultural introjects. And here thinking about P1, A1, and C1, then I'd really want to emphasize the taking of the introject in P2 into P1, and that rigidifying of that introject. So one of those introjects being taken into, one of the cultural introjects, into the P1 and rigidified and fantasized and, in a sense, enlarged. And that notion, of course, that it could be P1 plus or P1 minus, and projecting then the values, the rituals, the rules of that culture onto another, whether it's another individual or whether it's another in the sense of a group. So we could have this P1 minus projected onto a group of individuals, projected out, and that's where we have particular cultural forms of racism or ageism or national identity isms, as it were, in that projection. Carol Shadbolt wrote a really interesting article in the TAJ about this use of the P1 to actually harden cultures. She used it to explain why somebody who was homosexual might also be homophobic. We can certainly see this to explain internalized racism. So you may experience a Black person also being racist to Black people. It's the internalized ism process. And I think this is a really useful addition that Carol made. Again, a TAJ article, much more accessible than the Denton Roberts one, a fairly comparatively recent TAJ, about 10 years ago. And we might do that with any one of those different cultures that we looked at earlier, or with several. And whilst I named as the rings, as it were, around us, a whole number of different cultures, you of course could look at other cultural variations as well as the ones which I named. The ones I named go a bit beyond Denton Roberts. I think you can look at this, you can adapt this to fit the particular circumstances that you're working with or working in.
Sorry, Rosemary, what was the name of the lady who wrote an article that links to internalized racism? Was it Carol something?
Carol Shadbolt. I'll put it into the chat on the Zoom.
Yes, thank you.
But she wrote about internalized homophobia.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's the same process, I think, in internalized races. So I'll put it in here if I can. Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts here? Anybody got thoughts about this internalization process? Rawia, does it make sense to you? You talked about your internal cultural identities.
Yes, it definitely makes sense to me because, like I said before, being Ghanaian and Lebanese, and within the Ghanaian culture, there was the negativity and discrimination towards, white people, specifically also Lebanese, and within Lebanese, the negativity and discrimination against Black Ghanaian, and they formed me. I am those two parts. Yeah. So I think I've taken those messages from each side and expressed it towards the other side. So I do understand that internalized racism because I've also shown racist discriminating behaviors towards both, Yeah. So yeah. I would love to read more about that. I find it a really interesting topic.
And I think I want to emphasize it's an unconscious process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think it should lead us to being much more generous about some unconscious racism or culturalism which can occur because it's unconscious. There has been a lot of rubbishing in my country about the idea of unconscious bias, which is such a shame because that is really discrediting the whole idea of psychology and the notion that there are things out of awareness. Of course, there are things out of awareness, huge numbers of things out of awareness. And we all can trip over ourselves and make mistakes because of that. And we can all be intolerant because we are projecting out our culture and therefore intolerant of something which might seem to have different values. And to create an increase in tolerance of, let's call them mistakes, seems to be an almost impossible task at the moment in the Western world. And when I say the Western world, I mean the sort of first and second world in particular, which has a shared education system where there is a huge amount of old religious influence in the education system. So I think about India too, because Pooja, your experience of education in India was so influenced by the British idea of education. And, you know, I know there's all sorts of unconscious biases that happen because of that, even though it's a completely different part of the world.
Rosemary?
Yes.
Can I ask us, about what you've just said? The whole idea around unconscious bias, and yes, these behaviors and thoughts and attitudes are unconscious. And the idea is to bring self-awareness so the unconscious becomes conscious.
Yeah.
This is how I understand it.
Yeah.
And by having that self-awareness, the hope is that we will notice these behaviors and we will, try to do something about them and change our thinking and behaviors. However, we will make a mistake on and off because, like you say, it is unconscious and habitual. Am I understanding correctly what you've just shared?
Yes, and because it's so complex, if you look at that map, if you like, that you did of yourself earlier in this session, there are so many different cultures with so many messages, many of which you probably were not aware of, even though you've done years of TA training and TA therapy, and you've done all sorts of things about raising your consciousness.
Yeah.
I would guess that there were some messages this morning that you haven't realized that you'd swallowed whole and just, take as assume normal.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, absolutely. It's great that we have a commitment to raising our awareness.
Yeah.
It is a never-ending task.
Yeah. That's why I also think compassion is so important, that we show compassion really, because it is difficult.
Yeah, it's extraordinarily difficult.
Yeah.
And at the moment, we seem to have an intolerance about that, at least in the cultures that I'm moving in, which is such a shame.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? I was curious, Sharon, about how this speaks into you having moved into this British culture, which is not friendly. What you're making of that in your experience today?
It's very difficult for me because in actual fact, I grew up in Pretoria and I went to Pretoria Girls High School, which is a very much an Anglican, it was an Anglican school.
Yeah.
And so the value system that I introjected at that point in my life, which was my high school years, was very much an Anglican culture. And because I came from a home that was anti-religious, there must have been an introject of it's not good to be Jewish. And also it was just after the Second World War and the Holocaust. And so a lot of Jews at that time were trying to distance themselves from being Jewish because it was actually a survival mechanism, I would imagine. That if you could not be Jewish, then it was better for you than being Jewish because you could be exterminated. So there were those conflicting messages. And so for me, I've always had an affinity for British culture because that was actually the culture that I grew up in.
So that
And
educational culture. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And then I came here and found actually I don't have the same culture. And it's not that I've never been to Britain before. I've been here many, many times before I actually came to live here. And it was only when I started living here that I realized how different I am from the people here.
And isn't that key? You can
visit. And I'm struggling to find commonality with them.
Yeah.
You know, because I live in a block of flats where most of the people who live here are the same age as I, more or less the same age. So from an age point of view, we're, we come from the same culture, but we just don't actually understand. Well, I don't understand them, and they definitely do not understand me.
Yeah, because you have different parent ego states and child ego states, and that adult ego state is often not the usual ego state for most people. Sharon, come to the TA community. I think you will find more people in the TA community in UK that you might connect with, and hopefully you've connected a little bit with Sue just now, and we'll make
yes, I have.
Great.
And I've connected with people here before. You know, there are a number of people that I've been to for supervision who've examined me in exams, who have trained me. I've been on their training program, but they've all just vanished into the mist. And when I've tried to connect with them, they just disappeared. So, you know, it's very difficult coming from because I have a huge don't belong injunction. Because I've always belonged to a minority group wherever I've been from the day I was born.
And that takes me, along with your earlier story, of course, to think about TA and TA culture, because TA has its own culture.
Yeah,
and the TA associations would have some particular ones. But if you think about your story and think about Eric Byrne, also changed his name after World War II, really making his Jewish heritage recede into the background, because of course it was not a good time post World War II to be saying, hey, I'm Jewish. And the whole of TA itself really having a huge don't belong injunction. Who joins the people with a don't belong injunction? I would hypothesize in particular really are attracted to TA. It's the Groucho Marx thing. Who would join a club that would have me? It's that sort of thing that goes on. Yeah.
And I always felt a great affinity with the TA community, and I did feel that I belonged there until I came here.
Well, you probably still do belong here. And some of the people that you've had contact with in the past have retired or left. Or
yes, exactly. Well, most of the people that I had contact with have retired.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are new generations who also have their don't belong injunctions and that you might connect with. So I'll put you in Sue's good hands to follow through with, I hope, Sue, to alert Sharon to some of the things happening in the UK. And I say that to Sue because I'm not a member of the UK community particularly. I don't belong here within TA. And that's partly because the UK TA community is psychotherapy. And I am organisations and education and counselling. And it doesn't belong. I have been attempting for 20 years for them to use the word practitioner instead of the word psychotherapist. And I have given up.
Yeah.
So I belong internationally now, where the culture of the field is not as dominant as it is in the UK.
Yeah, well, that's how I feel too.
Yeah. So, So other thoughts, questions, comments, thinking about what you came along with, what perhaps drew you to come to this particular workshop. Thinking about your roots. Andrew and Linda, you were talking about roots and what that has and hasn't got to do with who you are now. And how are you responding to this idea that scripting is an ongoing process and that cultural scripting might be much more important than the scripting from mum and dad? How are you liking or not liking that idea?
It gives me more hope.
Good. How about others?
I've always thought that cultural scripting was more important than individual scripting, because I think it's impossible not to be impacted by all the things that you've mentioned. And so for me, what you did was you took stuff that I have thought about and put it into a usable framework, which makes a lot of sense to me.
Great.
So thank you for that.
How about others, particularly if you were trained in a classical TA way? This is radical stuff.
I've always felt that script is an ongoing thing. And though we talk about script cure, for me, that actually does mean putting another show on the road. So it means updating my script. It means maybe taking on another injunction and living by that. You know, for example, I too have a huge don't belong. No, I used to have a huge don't belong and don't exist, whereas now I say I have the right to exist and belong. But I've always sort of adhered to that kind of philosophy, but I appreciate you pulling it all together and giving me that permission to think that way rather than thinking, oh, this isn't really TA.
For those of you who are organisationally oriented, I want to emphasise it's why when I work with organisations, I will have no truck with suggestions that it's about personality when there is conflict in an organisation.
Good.
Because I think that organisational culture has been introjected. And if there are things going on, for example, bullying in the culture, it's a cultural phenomenon. It's not an individual phenomenon. And you will find individuals who take on leadership roles in an organisation and find themselves doing bullying and are shocked at themselves. But they usually aren't shocked with themselves until they've left the organisation. They look back and think, oh my God, how did I do that? It's because it was the culture and you had to belong, to adapt to the culture in order to survive. Just like right now on both sides of the war going on in Europe, people are involved in acts of brutality and in acts of heroism that they would never have imagined and now seem the norm for them. And they will not really realize what they might have done until the culture shifts, the war has ended, and they look back and think, oh, that was me, I did that. Or maybe with joy, they look back and think, hey, I did that. I did so much more than I ever thought I would be able to do. Any other thoughts from the TA perspective? Kirsty, you look like you're about to say something, maybe.
Yeah, I was thinking through the lens of being a new parent and feeling that responsibility of what are the different cultures that I'm exposing her to and how's that going to influence her script development. and thinking about some of the different cultures that I was exposed to that I'm choosing not to expose her to, and then thinking, well, I gained good things and unhelpful things from those. So she's going to miss out on the good things and hopefully the unhelpful things, but whatever she is exposed to will bring its own lot. So I think just looking at it through that kind of lens of being very conscious about parenting.
I'm very curious there too, as I'm about to become a grandparent, and I'm very curious about toys and gender.
Yeah.
And however much you might rear your child in non-gender specific colours and toys, how quickly and where and when do they suddenly pick up, guns are for boys and playing nurses is for girls, or whatever it is that will be prevalent. I'll be fascinated to see.
Something as simple as from the start, I've been adamant that I won't only dress her in pink. I don't think girls have to wear pink.
Yeah.
And
of
now,
course, if you are Mexican, hot pink is the colour in Mexico for everybody.
But then recently, a few people said to me, is it a boy or a girl? And I was like, oh, we better start dressing her in pink so people know she's a girl. And thinking, oh, what's that about?
Yes.
Where did that come from? So it's interesting.
Yeah. From your parent and from your child, I imagine, your structural ego states. Yeah.
See what's internalized, I guess. It's been very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'd like to just hear a brief 2 or 3 words from each of you. What are you taking away from here? And I'll go around my screen. Somebody begins, and then I'll hand to Alex to close. So somebody care to begin? 2 or 3 words. What are you taking away with you? Linda.
I'm going to consider religion more and how that impacts culture.
Yes. Particularly interesting in Holland, actually.
Very.
Marguerite.
What I was thinking, what am I going to take away? So much that it's difficult for me to say one particular thing. There is so much here. It's absolutely intriguing. So lots to think about and really enjoy.
Great. Pooja.
I've been staring at the book, looking at those concentric circles, the adaptation that you showed. So I think it's just that very concentric circle, the entire thing in its essence is what I'm taking back. I want to reflect more on that. Thank you for this adaptation.
Ritva, I know you were only here for a bit.
Yeah, but what I heard was this don't belong, and I think that is so typical for us in Finland. And that is something that made me think a lot. Thank you.
Karen.
I have to go, so I just want to say thank you very much. I think what I'm taking away is greater awareness, and I'm grateful for that.
Okay, look forward to seeing you in England.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
My most thoughtful moments are around the TA culture and my ongoing emergence as a TA trainer and supervisor. Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. And what do we perpetuate? Rawia.
For me, it's the amazing mix that you brought with these circles. I just find there's so much there. And the unconscious element of it all and how influential it is on our actions and behaviors and where my heart belongs. And it's not a location.
Yes. Yes. Sue.
A lot, I think. I really appreciate that you brought so many ideas together, that there's a kind of integration of this. I've also thought about other things that I've read wonderful book called The Cultural Map. I don't know if you're aware of it. Highlights.
Yeah.
Brilliant, isn't it? For looking at what's wrong in this organization. Why are they not communicating? So that's really lovely. And yeah, I want to go away and write and reflect further on this morning. So thank you very much, Rosemary.
Kirsty?
Yeah, just everything I said about parenting, and also that need to go away and actually be able to write down and reflect properly on this for myself, and then what am I passing on potentially. Thank you.
And Andrew?
Yeah, I've really enjoyed listening in and taking part as well. There was a metaphor that was starting to come to my mind around seeing those concentric circles and thinking about the human body, and how when we have fascia that moves really slickly over muscles and bones, things feel great. And occasionally there's an inflammation or a stuckness, and it's particularly unpleasant. And thinking of that as something to reflect on myself when I feel a stuckness, maybe there's a fascia or a layer of the onion that's inflamed in that moment, and what can I...
Lovely idea. Lovely idea. So I'm handing back to you, I think, to bring us to a close.
Yeah, well, I'm going to quickly pass the hot potato and invite Marguerite, who's our vice chairperson of the association, to say the closing and thank yous. So Marguerite.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And yeah, Rosemary, this was really intriguing and really rich. And I think I can speak for everyone in saying thank you very much for spending your time with us in this wonderful, wonderful, interesting way. You've given us a lot of food for thought, and we do appreciate it very much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This recording will be put onto our YouTube channel as well, if you want to check in on it as a resource in the months to come.
Great. And Kirsty's got the diagrams, so she'll send them around. And Kirsty, would you send me the YouTube link? That would be great.
Sure.
Thanks. Bye.
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 Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.